You know, the last time I was here, we were touring around ancient Egypt, and some of you came. How many came to that by chance? Went to the Egypt talk? I thought you were there. You were not there. A couple of people. Well, they came back. That was a double-header marathon. That was a long evening because we decided that there were two parts, and it was just easy to put them all together. So that was a 2-hour marathon. So they came back. So I guess it's okay to carry on. This is not going to be the case tonight. As it happens, most of the lectures in this series have been monographs on individual Atlanta architects, W.T. Downing, William Edwards, Willis Denny, or on historic styles of architecture, such as Ruskinian High Victorian Gothic, or Eastlake Victorian, which is the style of my own house. And in that context, you might justly assume that the Art Deco landmark that we're going to talk about tonight might be a Pringland Smith skyscraper in Atlanta, such as the William Oliver Building downtown, or the W.W. Orr Building, or maybe even the monumental post office annex by A. Ten Eyck Brown, now the Martin Luther King Federal Building. So it may be a shock, or at least an incongruous diversion, to discover that our topic tonight is, in fact, an ocean liner launched in 1932, contemporary with these buildings that I just mentioned in Atlanta, decorated by some of the finest Art Deco artists and craftsmen of their day, and ultimately sold for scrap 9 years after its 1935 maiden voyage, for which at the time it won the coveted Blue Riband for the fastest transatlantic crossing to date. It went from Le Havre in France to New York in 4 days, 3 hours, and 2 minutes. The technological merits that ensured her smooth sailing and speed were matched by the extraordinary design excellence of her interiors, accented throughout by wall panels, murals, sculpture, and especially glass. SS Normandie was the largest and the fastest and the most luxurious ocean liner of its day. And there is, moreover, an Atlanta connection to the SS Normandie, the Art Deco landmark that's our subject tonight. While the ship was not entirely unknown to me, it was only in researching the background of Atlanta architect and educator Paul M. Heffernan that I learned that the individual who was responsible for the overall interior decoration of the Normandie was Roger Henri Expert at left, whose atelier or studio Paul Heffernan joined as a student at the École des Beaux-Arts from 1935 to 37. He had just finished, Expert had just finished his work on the Normandie. Paul Heffernan was later to be the director of the architecture school at Georgia Tech. Among his students were people like John Portman and Jerry Cooper and George Heery and a whole range of different people. And one of the last things he did before he retired was hire me to come to Georgia Tech. So this was this was an interesting kind of connection that Heffernan had been in this atelier of Henri Expert at the École just prior to Expert's work on the Normandie. And it was a coincidence that I was eager to explore, not because I thought Heffernan had anything to do with the Normandie, which he did not, but because I was otherwise unfamiliar with Expert's career. And I soon discovered that his notable coordination with contemporary artists from René Lalique, soon discovered that he was working with these contemporary artists from France, from René Lalique, who's probably the most famous, the glassmaker, to Jean-Théodore Depas and Jean Dunant and others, resulting in what really is a masterpiece of Art Deco interior design. The ocean liner of the French fleet was launched in 1932, and it embarked on its maiden voyage on May 29th, 1935, just about the time that Harvard student Paul Heffernan was en loge in America preparing his Paris Prize competition drawings. Among the artists associated with Normandy, perhaps the best known is René Jules Lalique. Lalique is known for his jewelry design and the Art Nouveau aesthetic. He later created some remarkable automobile hood ornaments, which are called mascots. The 1928 Spirit of the Wind, which is also sometimes known as Victoire, and Chrysis, 3 years later, are classic Art Deco designs at the eve of the Great Depression. And around 1934, Lalique was significantly involved in two notable commissions of architectural and naval interior design, both engaging him at the same time, and remarkable considering the depressed economy at the time of their creation. In 1934, Florence Boots, if you're British, you've heard of Boots Pharmacies. She's the widow of the pharmacy magnate Boots the chemist, commissioned Lalique to remodel an 1840 church known as St. Matthew Millbrook on Jersey, the largest of the Channel Islands. After Lalique's remodeling, St. Matthew became famously known as the Glass Church. It is a masterpiece of Lalique's heavy, clouded glass where altar screens and cross and baptismal font and decorative elements throughout are masterpieces of Lalique glass. His glass figures stand elongated as though the western portal jambs of Chartres Cathedral had been translated to translucent glass. Well, this work was executed during the months between the 1932 launch of the ocean liner Normandie and its maiden voyage in June of 35. Normandie was to be the pride of the French ocean liner fleet, and its Lalique glasswork, other installations, and the various Roger Henri Expert interiors, it was one of the most luxurious of the liners of the day. For the first-class dining room, for instance, Lalique designed lighting columns, 12 pillars of glass that were 16 feet high, huge glass chandeliers, and all of the dining room tableware, including glass, silver, and porcelain. A single platinum-leafed Lalique suite dinner plate from the SS Normandie was offered recently on eBay for $1,250. That's one plate from this collection. And in December 2016, Christie's auctioned off an 8-piece set of Lalique glassware from Normandie for $12,500. Well, with such appointments, the ship owners were clearly targeting upper-class passengers, providing relatively few second and third-class accommodations aboard. And out of the total passenger capacity of about 1,972, 864, which is 44%, were first class. 654, about a third of them, were second class or tourist class, and 454, just 23%, in third class. But against those 1,972, there were 1,345 crew members. 2 crew members for every 3 passengers. And between 1935 and 1939, the ship made 69 and a half round trips from Le Havre to New York. Now that just means it was launched in Le Havre, and it would go, that's a round trip, that's a round trip, and then it got to New York and never went back, and there's a story behind that. Although the ship usually met its operating expenses, it barely did. The Normandie was not a commercial success, and Normandie's active service turned out to be very short-lived, but more on that in just a moment. Expert's drawings for Normandie's first-class public spaces were elegant, and with fashionably chic but relatively small-scaled figures in the sketches, the public rooms appear majestic and especially spacious when you think of these being on a ship. Indeed, the first-class dining room alone was the length of a football field and had a ceiling 28 feet high. And aboard the SS Normandie, as Ellen White has written, quote, a passenger standing on the grand staircase outside the Normandie's Café Grill would have been awed by the vast sweep of the smoking room leading to the grand salon, leading to the gallery salon, to the upper hall, and to the theater. A complete stern-to-bow view obscured only by Bodé's 8-foot-high statue of the peasant La Normandie, which is at one end of it. The first-class dining room alone accommodated 700 diners and featured a space boasted to be longer than the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. It measured end to end 305 feet long, as I say, about the size of a football field, 46 feet wide, and a colossal 28 feet high, as I mentioned. It's a striking volume carved out of the center of the ship. And with no windows or portholes, the space was lighted by glittering Lalique glass, chandeliers, glass pillar lights, glass sconces.
Oh, so those aren't windows.
No. The dining room's glass walls were by Auguste Labré, and they're, quote, they're constructed with a layer of mirrored glass that was covered with another layer made of glass lozenges interspersed with vertical corduroy stripes of hammered glass. And this outer layer prevented the walls from having a reflective quality like the Hall of Mirrors. Instead, the glass provided a shimmering effect further enhanced by illuminating the walls from within. So Roger Henri Expert and Richard Beauwans, for instance, collaborated on the fumeur, or the smoking room, that is the Grand Salon. The smoking room featured lacquer wall panels with designs by Jean Dunand. An example is Dunand's group of panels called the Harvest, 110 separate panels designed for the room. The general theme is man's games and pleasures, including the representations of a hunt or fishing, la pêche, and sports, the latter with athletic figures throwing javelins and discs. Here is the harvest and some of the fishing scenes. And then the left side, the Durand images, including figures which I'm showing influenced by Egyptian wall paintings and sized elements, such as the one on the right from the great temple of Abu Simbel. Of course, keeping in mind that the Normandie is 32 and 1922 is when Howard Carter discovered King Tut's tomb. So there was this sort of surge of Egyptomania that was coming out, and it's felt in at least this detail. So comparing a set of sort of fishing scenes, which you see here, which I just showed a moment ago. This is from a mastaba at Saqqara. The grayish wall paintings on the right from Saqqara date from 2321 BC, which is longer ago on the other side of Christ than we are on this side. And two battle scenes, which I showed a moment ago. Oops. The one on the right depicting Ramses II from the Abu Simbel temple. The smoking room was not an exclusively male domain. However, it was functioned as a tea room during the afternoons. And it was also a corridor or vestibule to the Cafe Grill, accessed by a short flight of stairs from the fumeur. Throughout his public spaces, Expert created an open plan rather than compartmentalizing rooms. He used sliding panels normally open to the Grand Salon, converted the combined space to an evening ballroom when a carpet could be rolled up to reveal a parquet flooring for dancing. And in all, Expert spaces were notable for their modern challenges to traditional functions and for the inner connections of spaces for reflecting popular modern aesthetics in the way of Art Deco ornament. The entry wall of the smoking room, for instance, featured a large scene called La Chaise, or The Hunt, whose brilliant colors, you can see on the bottom, are illustrated in that one view. On the reverse side, that is the Grand Salon side, is the masterful Art Deco Chariot of Aurora by Jean Dupas, a lacquered relief surfaced in gold and silver and now in the Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh. Well, classic mythology also appeared as a theme in Expert's Grand Salon, which featured a massive gilded glass panel by muralist Jean Dupas. The panel illustrated the mythical birth of Aphrodite, the rape of Europa, the chariot of Theta, and the chariot of Poseidon. The myths are referenced in the lower portion of the Grand Salon glass murals that overall illustrate the history of navigation. That theme of the history of navigation was Expert's idea, but these were designed by Jean Dupas and executed by Charles Champaigneux. The color panels illustrated here are details marked in red boxes. You can see where the larger details in color are just taken from what was a huge mural as shown inside the red boxes. And these glass murals employed a technique called verre églomissé. It's an ancient process which had been revived in the 18th century in France, and the French were anxious to keep that craft alive, so that they were sponsoring some of these panels in that technique in order to support the craftspeople in France. So the history of navigation murals depict ships from across the world and centuries. Egyptian dhows, Chinese junks, 16th century galleons, and 19th century paddle steamers. And below this eclectic mixture of ships are the figures from classical mythology associated with the sea, especially Aphrodite and Poseidon. And so the artist avoids revisionist historicism by reinterpreting rather than reviving precedent. In other words, an Art Deco approach. And another large corner panel from the History of Navigation series is shown in color with the chariot of Poseidon shown at the bottom right. Its position in the larger panel delineated in red at that bottom right piece. So you can see that's just it's a blow up on the left side, and the entire piece is on the top. Louise Lippincott and William Reel, who are curators at the Carnegie Museum, have written about the architect expert. Quote, "The idea for a decorative scheme combining the gods and goddesses of antiquity with the history of modern navigation originated with the room's architect, Henri Expert, as evidenced in his original sketches," and that's what some of these views are now of those sketches. In accepting the responsibility for the interior design of a major public salon of Normandy, Roger Expert's mandate was to create a national treasure. The highly decorative interior styling was intended to be a showplace for French culture, establishing French hegemony in matters of taste. One author summarized the challenge as a commission, quote, "to create maritime environments of haute décor as a symbol of national identity. Normandy was ordained to be an ambassador of French artistic and engineering talent," unquote. And therefore, for the interior of the ship, a virtual roll call of French masters of Art Deco idiom collaborated with painted and gilded glass murals by Dupas, with lacquer panels by Nunant, with sculpture by Dijon. That's actually on the left side of that view. And then these large pewter urns by Maurice Donat, and especially glass by René Lalique. The use of marble, gilded and incised wall panels, murals, and Lalique glass decoration created elegant and chic interiors throughout the first-class spaces. And during a time of economic depression, the project provided opportunities and venues for French craftsmen, sponsored by a government that wished to sustain the skills of the artisans and prevent a rapid loss of knowledge of the crafts that were involved. The government hoped to support and maintain France's craft industry, indeed preserve skills that otherwise would have been lost. The SS Normandy, by the way, is sort of a high point in period Art Deco interior design, and as it may relate to spaces you're familiar with, it is contemporary with Donald Deskey's 1932 Radio City Music Hall in New York, whose interiors are quite spectacular as well. And all of this was ultimately inspired by the exposition in France called the Exposition des Arts Décoratifs et Industriels Modernes, which was held, basically the Art Deco exhibit in Paris. It was held in 1925 in Paris, and from which the term Art Deco derives. Now, if you look on the left screen, that's a first-class lounge in the SS France from 1912. A bit stodgy, not at all what was going on not that much later. Compared to the 1912 dining room of the SS France, Expert's Normandy interiors were remarkably modern, elegant, and purposefully au courant. Nothing was to be stodgy or old-fashioned. The era of palatial, over-upholstered furnishings and patterned damask with floral wall hangings was over. The modern aesthetic was cleaner, slicker, more chic, and rather than attempting directly to translate interiors from ashore, designers began to create distinct looks for ocean liners, which came to be known as le style paquebot, the ocean liner style. In a letter to his wife, Vida Sackville-West, passenger Harold Nicholson commented, quote, "The whole place is like a setting for a ballet. Choruses of stewards and sailors, some 50 liftiers, which were elevator operators in bright scarlet, who look like petals of salvia flying about those golden inn corridors. This is the essential effect. Gold, Lalique glass, and scarlet," unquote. Well, indeed, the designers could be theatrical and grand and monumental, as the great sweep of the smoking room, grand salon, dining room, grand staircase, and theater demonstrate. Interior design and Art Deco decorative arts had risen to the level of fine art and architecture, and Deco artisans like Lalique were now celebrities. The most notable of artisans was given carte blanche in Normandie's public rooms, and the ship was considered a masterpiece of Art Deco. However, when France declared war against Germany on September 3rd, 1939, just 4 years after Normandie's maiden voyage, the ship, which had docked at Pier 88 in New York on August 28th, was held in New York by the U.S. government, believing it would be captured by the Nazis collaborating with Vichy government if it returned to France. Today, the USS Intrepid, CVS-11, an aircraft carrier, is at Pier 86, one over to where the Normandie was at that time. The Intrepid is now the Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum. Normandy was officially seized by the U.S. government 5 days after Pearl Harbor, and the ship was transferred to the U.S. Navy 2 weeks later. The Navy rechristened the ship the USS Lafayette, and work began to convert the luxury liner to an aircraft and troop transport ship. When the U.S. entered the European War, the logistics of transporting troops to Europe encouraged the use of ocean liners as temporary troop transports. HMS Queen Mary, for instance, was converted to a troop transport and carried 15,740 troops to Europe from the U.S. on a transatlantic run in July of 1943, setting a record for the most troops in one passage. The American Navy's renamed SS Lafayette was intended to perform a similar military service. And during the process of conversion of Normandy to Lafayette, workers began to remove for storage valuable murals, wall panels, statuary, urns, Lalique glass chandeliers, decorative furnishings, sconces, Art Deco artwork. They began to strip the Normandy. And on February 9th, 1942, at about 2 p.m., a worker was removing a decorative sconce from a promenade deck salon when a spark from his acetylene torch set ablaze piles of very flammable life jackets stacked nearby. The ship's fire extinguishing system had been deactivated as part of the ship conversion, and the fire spread rapidly. New York firefighters came along. They thought they had it under control and finally extinguished at 9 p.m. But then it rekindled amidship, and firefighters pumped tons of water into the ship from the dock and from fireboats. Water began to fill in upper compartments. And of course, it started to cause the ship to become top-heavy, and she began to list. And then she began to list further. Smoke had been emerging from one of the funnels, and when the ship was again ablaze, more water, and she continued to list further, exposing more of the metal surfaces of the vast hull. And then water froze overnight on the exposed hull, and Normandie continued to list. By daybreak, the 83,000-ton ship had finally capsized entirely. Well, focus then turned to efforts to right the ship, and the salvage operation would take 17 and a half months. In order to lessen, I guess, the center of gravity, it was decided to remove all the decks and the ship's structure above the promenade deck, including all the ship's masts, the three huge streamlined funnels, the bridge, the officers' quarters, the sun deck, and the boat deck. Sheathing and other building fabric was stripped, and selected compartments within were made watertight with water removed, and then some 900 tons of concrete was strategically pumped into add weight where needed to promote the righting of the hull. And you see what they're trying to do throughout, with most of the upper part of the ship stripped. And throughout the year and a half, the assumption was still active that if they could right the ship, it could be converted to a troop transport. So Coast Guardmen guarded the pier and the ship's hull 24/7 for a good 18 months. And finally, on August 7th, 1943, Normandie was righted sufficiently to begin to float again. And on September 15th, 1943, she was reclassified an aircraft and transport ferry, APV-4, a role that she would never play. Tugboats eased her out of the mud to tow her to dry dock in Port Newark, New Jersey, for further repair and conversion. And when she passed again in the foreground of New York skyline, as she had some 60 times before, as France's, indeed the world's most luxurious ocean liner, she was now a pitiful sight. Never repaired, Normandie, or the AKA Lafayette, sat in dry dock for the duration of World War II. Her hull was too damaged, her machinery deteriorated, and the manpower needed to make her seaworthy was thought better used on more critical war projects. Lafayette was stricken from the Navy list on the 11th October 45, and 11 months later, in September 46, President Harry Truman issued an executive order to authorize her disposal.
Have they gotten all the stuff out of it?
Pretty much. I'll show you in a minute. On October 3rd, 1944, she was sold for scrap for $161,000, which was slightly over 1/4% of the $60 million it took to build her in the first place. Workers began to break up the ship with its last pieces of steel hauled away by rails to mills in Pennsylvania and melted into components for automobiles, building girders, and household appliances of different sort. It was an ignominious end to a masterpiece of Art Deco design, modern technology, and design and fabrication excellence. Creative brain and brawn reduced to scrap metal. Well, there is a small silver lining. Some of the interior decor and artwork was preserved and is now in private collections and art museums. An example is these huge panels of the history of navigation executed by Jean Dupas, made of glass, paint, and gold and silver and platinum leaf. The mural was one of 4 large murals designed and executed by Champigny in 1934 for the first-class Grand Salon. It's now in the Metropolitan Museum of New York. The grandeur of these panels, and perhaps that of the Grand Salon itself, can only be appreciated by seeing a scale figure stand in front of these things. They're huge.
Yeah.
The 20-foot bronze doors designed by Raymond Stubbs, visible at the left from deck B foyer outside the first-class dining room. If you open those doors, you come to that football field-sized dining room. That's what it opens onto. But these doors are now adorning Our Lady of Lebanon Maronite Catholic Church in Brooklyn Heights, New York. And there they are on the church. 6 roundels on the front door and 4 on the side door. The doors on the ship were so high that they had to cut them in 4 and 6 to even house it in a large church application.
They were one.
They were all one panel initially, and they put them into all 10 of these roundels were supposed to be symbols of towns of Normandy. The front door roundels of the church were representing Lisieux, Saint-Lô, Évreux, Caen, Rouen, and Cherbourg, and the side door panels depict Le Havre, and Alençon, Dieppe, and Falaise. And of course, the use at the church, splitting them into 2 doors, suggests the scale of the original 20-foot high doors on the foyer of the Normandie. These are the doors that open to the 305-foot length of the dining room. And inasmuch as Normandy was a floating hotel, some of its furnishings and art found their way into urban hotels and apartment buildings in the United States. Normandy paneling and some furniture was moved to the so-called Normandy Lounge of the Chicago Hilton Hotel, where they are today. And the Norman Knight, which was housed on the ship, gracing the entry door to the chapel of the ship, is now in a reception lobby of the Normandy Court Apartments on 95th Street in New York, on the right screen. The statue of a Norman peasant, which was known as La Normandie, sculpted by Léon-Georges Baudry for the ship, was trashed and then rediscovered and transferred to Florida to be displayed for almost half a century at various locations in the garden, then the lobby, then the spa of the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami. The architect of the Fontainebleau, Morris Lapidus, was just up, I don't know what he was doing in the junkyard in Brooklyn, but he saw him there and he paid, I can't remember what he paid, but he bought them and took them back down to the Fontainebleau. On the ocean liner Normandie, this 8-foot high bronze namesake sculpture originally stood at the top of the staircase at one end of the first-class dining room. In 1954, Lapidus found the statue in a scrapyard and bought it for $1,200. 47 years later, when Celebrity Cruise Lines bought the hotel in Miami Beach, Dimitri Kaparis, a senior vice president of the cruise line, moved the statue to the dining room of the Celebrity Summit. So if you go a cruise on the Celebrity line, you can see it. And then later it was moved again to their latest vessel, the Celebrity Summit, displayed initially it was on the Celebrity line and then moved to the Summit. They also have a couple of panels that we saw earlier from the Normandy smoking room, the one called the Hunt, known as La Chaise, in two parts that are against that dining room. These panels were subsequently moved to the latest class of celebrity ship called the Celebrity Edge, which was launched in 2018. The Normandy's large 1,000-pound bronze sculpture, which was a formidable figure known, and here are the move in the second location in another one of these celebrity cruise line dining rooms. But the larger of the sculptures from the Normandy was known as La Paix, or the Peace. It overlooked the first-class dining room, and it's now in Pine Lawn Cemetery in New York. The figure statue is the work of Louis de Jean. Well, a few works of art from Normandy are in the hands of private collectors. You probably have heard of Malcolm Forbes. He was almost late to his son Robert's wedding in 1981 when he attended an auction at Sotheby's to bid on panels from Normandy's Grand Salon, which he acquired for Robert as a wedding present. He paid $99,000 for them. Wow. And the 8 panels were part of Jean Dupas's Birth of Aphrodite. The black and white view shows where the whole panel is in the lounge, and the color is the view of just that piece that was saved and bought by Forbes, part of that Birth of Aphrodite paneling. For almost 3 decades, between 1985 and 2014, Forbes' purchase was displayed at the Forbes Gallery on Fifth Avenue. I guess he took it back from Robert and put it in his gallery. The 8 panels were ultimately resold in 2015. He spent $99,000. He resold them for $1,392,000. So $1.25 million profit. And other collectors were more private. There's a blogger named Nick Gray who's passionately scouting the auctions and the locations of these Normandy memorabilia. And he's illustrated a ballroom of a private collector in Houston, Texas, where fragments of the panels from the History of Navigation mural are from the Grand Salon, adorn the Texans ballroom. And the same collector displayed in the hallway, bottom left, a framed mast of a ship, and 12 different panels, which appear in another post, appear to be on the same ballroom wall. So I don't know if he resold the first set and bought another set to replace them. And some prominent museums have also been eager to add these panels to their collections. The Brooklyn Museum, which is the image on the right, has a small Vert et Glumacé panel by Dupas, also from the Grand Salon of the Normandy. And at left are 4 panels from the Rape of Europa, part of the collection now of a museum in Nantes, France. And the murals of the sports from Jean Dunant's series of panels of men's games and pleasures that I showed you in situ from the Normandy a few minutes ago. These originally were from the smoking lounge, now part of another museum installation. An almost abstract depiction of earth, 4 winds, and the sea, known as the Chariot of Aurora, designed by Jean Dupas, for the aft doors from the Grand Salon into the smoking room, were acquired by Frederick Koch at auction in 1984. He then turned around and donated them to the Carnegie Museum of Art, where they are displayed in this wonderful room of just that wall. And finally, as I noted, one of the 4 corner panels representing the history of navigation from the Grand Salon, including the Chariot of Poseidon, is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. So, considering what the ship looked like after these fires on the inside of these same spaces, there is some consolation that all was not lost in the 1942 fire and the capsizing of the Normandy at Pier 88 in New York. And due to the government's intention to convert the liner to a troop transport ship. Furniture, fixtures, art, and all manner of decorative arts throughout the ship had already been removed and sent to warehouses for storage until the war ended, was the intention, and the ship could be returned to service as a luxury liner. It was indeed, as mentioned earlier, a worker in the process of removing one of the Art Deco sconces that caused the blaze when his torch set fire to a pile of life jackets. It seems ironical that it was life jackets that killed the ship.
Sounds like
It was made out of a material called capote, which is apparently great for flotation but highly flammable. And as soon as that flame hit it, there is.
And none of it went back to France?
None of it's there. So there is one odd postscript to this. I promised that I would bring this slightly back to Atlanta. And if you'll indulge me, this is a piece that's actually written up in the Vietnam book that is for sale in the back, but you might find this interesting as the postscript. Those who are book readers might find in that book a chapter entitled Interior Decorator for a Warship. And it's an account of my own role as an interior decorator for a large ship. Hardly a transatlantic luxury liner, but rather a U.S. Navy aircraft carrier. USS Intrepid is an Essex-class aircraft carrier commissioned during World War II and later served 3 deployments to Vietnam. We compare it to the Normandie. She measures 872 feet bow to stern compared to 1,029 for Normandie, carries a complement of 3,448 officers and enlisted compared to Normandie's 1,900 passengers and 1,300 crew, which is 4,300 total. And Intrepid as a warship could reach a speed of 33 knots compared to the heavier Normandie's 29 knots. The statistics are not so dissimilar, although the interior design was. I can't resist, therefore, sharing this postscript, perhaps a more notorious episode of my own role in remodeling the enlisted sailors' mess decks on the aircraft carrier in 1969 when I served as food service officer aboard USS Intrepid. As food service officer, I was responsible for between 7,500 and 10,000 meals a day, and presumably also in charge of sailors' morale. Intrepid was and is a big ship, but the mess decks lacked any kind of character. Featured standardized folding long tables, colorless chairs, bulkheads, that is walls, like compartments throughout the ship. They were all painted standardized Navy interior green. Every Navy ship is gray on the outside and green on the inside, and that's what it looked like. So predictable. Even the officers' bunks for the officers' quarters were gray and inside navy green walls. So when the aircraft carrier returned to the States after its 3rd deployment to Vietnam, money was assigned to the Intrepid to improve the enlisted men's leisure areas of the ships, particularly the mess decks. And I was reassigned to serve as food service officer because my boss saw me in the office painting a watercolor. And you can see the influence of the navy green on the watercolor. This I called Feininger Goes Sailing, influenced by the modern painter Feininger. So I was doing this watercolor, and my boss, the senior supply officer on the ship, says, "Aha, an artiste." And I say, he charged me to find something to do with the bizarre array of purchases that the chief petty officer in food service had already made, using up almost all the available rehabilitation funds with no one having any idea what to do with this stuff. Plastic Tiffany-style chandeliers, corral posts, Frederick Remington prints, wanted posters, spurs, lassos. Now there's a theme. orange and black draperies, red and white peppermint striped awnings, even fake brick siding. What are we going to do with this stuff? Now, this was a career Navy petty officer that bought all this, so used up all the money, and so I'm suddenly charged to use it to remodel the mess decks.
They ought to have done something to that.
So the commanding officer was interested in ship morale, although Horace Newland Moore Jr., ignominiously known on the ship as Weird Horace, would later run the aircraft carrier aground off Jamestown Island in Rhode Island, bringing his Navy career to a major downturn. But you don't run aircraft carriers up on the island. Soon after, sailors could go into a local dockside bar and tavern in Newport and order a new alcoholic drink, which was known as Intrepid on the Rocks. Then there was the XO, the executive officer, Commander Newark, who was the immediate boss of my own boss, Commander Bosco. And at the bottom of the chain of command was me, Lieutenant J.G. Craig, who could barely boil an egg and was now assigned as the food service officer for the aircraft carrier and charged to oversee the feeding of the 10,000, but more importantly, to gather these bizarre purchases of the chief petty officer and use them to decorate the mess decks. Where was Lalique when I needed him? So given the somewhat unmilitary nature of my personality, I determined to get rid of the shipboard green on all the mess decks walls and paint them instead every non-military color I could think of. I thought tangerine was very interesting, butterscotch, and baby blue. I grouped wood corral posts and fencing to create a cowboy paraphernalia and a Western theme. And then I wired the room for music and recorded Willie Nelson and other country and Western songsters on a reel-to-reel tape that we piped into that section of the third deck, mess decks, all through hidden speakers that were way up amongst the pipe. Then I converted another ship compartment into a simulated sidewalk Parisian cafe, using the fake brick and the peppermint striped awning to create a storefront, built in a wishing well, which we had to move away to let the ordnance go by and during general quarters, and wrapped in brick, complete with plastic ivy and a hanging bucket. And when general quarters or shipwide announcements were not sounding, overhead speakers were piping in songs by Edith Piaf or Maria Mathieu or Charles Aznavour. Now, ignoring the sideway glances of my fellow officers who started calling me the clinger of the Navy, I let my creative juices go wild, or at least unmilitary. And as the remodeling drew to a close in late 1969, 1970, we entered Intrepid in the Navy's Nay Award competition, which recognizes the best food service operations among U.S. Navy ships afloat, as well as shore facilities, including officers' clubs, all competing worldwide in food service. And we found success since no one on the inspection team had seen anything like our mess decks. We reached the semifinals, and when the final inspection team of senior supply officers was to come aboard, I vowed that they would experience nothing like what they'd seen on any other ship. They were to dine in the mess decks. One unexpected feature of the mess decks was ice carvings. I kid you not. I asked my chief petty officer, the guy to blame for all this other stuff, highly knowledgeable and experienced with 30 years of experience in food service, if he'd ever done any ice carvings. He looked at me as though I was crazy and said, "Of course not." And I said, "Neither have I." And then I said, "Meet me at the ice locker in 20 minutes. The team of inspectors is due about in 2 hours." So we got blocks of ice and paid and set. We each took a block of ice and started chipping away. I thought I would make a swan, but as I started to shape the delicate neck, I concluded that it would melt before the Nay Award judges saw it. So the S form reached a certain awkward bulk, and I turned it around and finished the ice sculpture as a squirrel. And the fat swan's neck became the squirrel's tail, and the ice rodent held a tray of ice containing nuts at the end of the food service line. And Chief Petty Officer Robert Dunlap created a sailboat, and we lined the gunnels with shrimp, complete with cocktail sauce on the boat's bow. The inspection team had never witnessed such a display on board a Navy ship, and the food was good as well. So the images, these images, by the way, are not our actual images. We didn't get those recorded at the time. But when the competition results was published, USS Intrepid was awarded first place among large ships afloat worldwide, and third place overall among all ship types, small and large, and shore facilities. So Intrepid was already 27 years old when I was discharged from the Navy in 1970. In fact, the ship was commissioned during World War II in August of '43. It was older than I was. But having served in those years on the aircraft carrier, the carrier finally met its day when, it was too old, they weren't going to deploy it anymore, and so it was decommissioned in March of 1974 and scheduled, like the Normandie, to be scrapped, or at least to put into mothballs. That meant that they were going to strip anything movable inside the ship and just send it to the Navy's nautical graveyard. However, a few years later, following a campaign to save her, the aircraft carrier was moved to Pier 88 in New York and recommissioned to serve as Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum, which is now a National Historic Landmark. The ship, as military museum, would tell the story of its long history as a warship, including documenting the sailor's life at sea in the 1960s. And I thought, aha! At that point, I met the chief curator of the new Navy Ship Museum. He was an architectural historian who specialized in Chicago architecture. We were both on the board of the Society of Architectural Historians in Chicago. And I cornered curator John Zukowski and learned that he had just been made curator of the new Intrepid Museum. And he just learned that I had lived on the ship for 2 years in the 1960s, and asked what I did on board while I was there. Well, that was a question he shouldn't have asked. I said, I was dispersing officer or paymaster initially, but then I got transferred rather suddenly to food service as food service officer. And then I couldn't resist. I told him what I did. And he said, Craig, you are so full of it. You no more did that than a man in the moon. He said, a French cafe in a Western room on an aircraft carrier? And I said, yep. And he said, no, I don't believe you. And so I said, I'll send you pictures. And I had color photographs that we made at the time of all that. Of course, here is the museum, and here is what I sent him.
Oh, fabulous.
So he looked at me and said, we'll put them back. And today, if you go to New York and go aboard Intrepid and go down to the mess decks and return, you will see those awful orange draperies and the corral posts and all this stuff in a partial display. I couldn't talk him into putting the French cafe back. I'm still working on that. He said, we have too many Boy Scouts and Cub Scouts that come aboard. I said, do you think if this survives sailors that you're going to have trouble with Boy Scouts? So anyway, I couldn't convince him. But they did have a really interesting display panel that made a reference, and if you can see down at the bottom of the long quote, it's got my name as Lieutenant J.G. Robert Craig, Food Service Officer, 1970, under the headline of Renovating Intrepid's Mess. And so let me read you the quote. Who's responsible for these colors? My trembling knees announced that I was, as I stood before a team of officers who were conducting an inspection of the general mess. I've been told to use my imagination in decorating, and I would be the first to admit that orange and sunshine yellow were not the most military colors available in the supply system. unquote. Well, that supply panel about summed it up. And what you can do, if you ever get up there, is you can go to this same area where there's an exhibit kiosk, and you push the button, and up comes my mug with a confession that I'm responsible for what you're just looking at of all these god-awful colors. So later in the year of 1970, my tour of duty ended. I was honorably discharged from the Navy, fooling them to the very end. And I went to Cornell to study architecture. And 3 years after that, I came to Georgia Tech to teach. And recognizing that Tech's architecture school is one of the best design schools in the country, I never mentioned my role as an interior decorator for an Essex-class aircraft carrier. The director of Tech's architecture program, after all, the man who hired me, was Paul Heffernan, and he had studied in Paris with Roger Expert, the chief decorator of the first-class dining room and reception spaces of the Normandie. Perhaps my role as an interior decorator for a warship should remain my secret, but now it's yours as well.